And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our final keynote speaker for the conference. Dr. Thomas Nielsen is an associate professor at the University of Canberra. He advocates a curriculum of giving, and his research shows that giving and service to others increases well-being and academic outcomes in students. Please welcome Dr. Thomas Nielsen.
I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which the 2016 National Volunteering Conference is taking place. In the first class of semester, I sometimes surprise my teacher education students by asking them if they are aware of how much I actually earn. Naturally, they look a little stunned. I then go on to say that I earn so much that I can go and buy a whole chocolate cake every day and go home and sit and gorge myself. That's how much I earn. I then also tell them about my mother, that when she was a little girl during Germany's occupation of Denmark in the Second World War, her family enjoyed a teaspoon of jam on a Friday night. Because of food rationing, that was all they had for a treat. And it was the best dessert ever. The point I want to get across to my students is that there's a lot more wisdom required on my part in my dessert eating compared to that of the context of my mother's childhood. Because of scarcity, she had no problem savoring that spoonful of jam, and she had no problems overeating either. I suddenly realized the significance of my talk. You're all sitting there and munching along. I hadn't realized that when I was writing it. I, on the other hand, am often struggling whenever I stand in front of the fridge, contemplating how much chocolate cake is really needed now. Well, unless one of the students have already asked the question, I then ask the class what they think my culinary anecdotes have to do with promoting positive learning environments, since that is the subject that they have enrolled in. We then have a rich discussion about the many seemingly paradoxical aspects of modern culture. That, for example, economically we are so much better off now than at the end of the Second World War. And yet the World Health Organization informs us that suicide and depression rates have risen significantly worldwide in the same period. We also look at the statistics showing that mental health issues affect a lot more people now, and that depression is 10 times more common than 50 years ago. We talk about the fact that it's such an astonishing world full of technological and material advancements, but that it is also a world that many do not seem terribly happy to be living in. We end up slightly confused as we come up with more questions than answers. How come we can't seem to manage our own eating habits with obesity skyrocketing globally, putting incredible strain on our healthcare systems because of obesity-related diseases? How come a teaspoon of jam can be the best dessert ever just because there are no options for seconds? And why is it exactly that we are more depressed and suicidal considering the exponential material and technological progress that we have made for over half a century now? But this is exactly where I want my students to be, for now at least, wrestling with these issues, because when it comes down to it, they are issues close to their own hearts. They are personal and they are painful. 1 in 4 of my students have mental health issues, including anxiety, depression, suicide ideation. As we are talking about the world, we are talking indirectly about them and their pain. We're talking about my pain We're talking about the pain of all of us, and they know it, consciously or subconsciously. And just to prove my point, that here's some slides that illustrate the influence of a complex world, not just on young people, but all of us. I know the kids don't like you and they pick on you, but you have to go to school. You're the teacher. That's how I feel on Monday mornings sometimes. I can't continue working these hours. I feel as though I'm missing Michael's childhood. His name is Mark. Hope that's not you. Yet. I like Looney Strawix, the ever-expanding universe, the ever-shrinking one. And don't get me wrong, these things are fantastic, aren't they? The way they have helped us and how we can get in contact with anybody of our family or whoever at any point in time. It's not to bunk technology. We're using it now. But I just find it so interesting that now it takes a lot more wisdom, doesn't it, to switch this one off than because we have the opportunity now to be on it all the time. Now, it is in this context that giving, and by extension, volunteering, might be a key to solving the pressing challenges of our world today. Now, I know what you're thinking. This proposition may at first sound far-fetched, especially given the enormity of some of the challenges we face, such as high depression and suicide rate, but also climate change, financial instability, and ideological extremism, just to name a few. However, if we stop for a moment to consider this idea that giving might be a key solution, we realize the promise it holds. We also realize that it's a promise supported by evidence-based research. We now have congruent data from several fields, such as positive psychology and health and medical research, showing that sustainable well-being outcomes come not from having more money or by being a consumer. It comes from having meaningful happiness in our lives. Pleasurable happiness, the happiness we get from having our senses stimulated, is a wonderful dimension in our lives, but it is meaning that gives us the deepest levels of happiness. I probably should point out here that money is important, but up to a very surprisingly basic level. It's basically when we can feed ourselves and have a roof over our heads, and we don't have to worry about our children being hungry and that sort of. That basic level, it's after that the link between more money and happiness disappears. People scoring high, in fact, on pleasurable happiness have happiness that goes up and down constantly. That's the problem with chocolate cake. As soon as one piece is gone, we need another to feel the same hit of sugar and fat in the bloodstream. And the problem, as we've noted, of being able to eat as much as we want is that it challenges our capacities to moderate and savor. The very abilities, in fact, with which we best appreciate the occasional treat. People who score high on meaningful happiness, on the other hand, have more stable and higher or deeper levels of happiness, if you like, and that don't disappear so easily, even when we are not doing the activity that makes us happy. People with high levels of meaningful happiness also recuperate quicker from trauma and adversity, what we all will experience at some point in our lives. In a word, meaningful happiness is synonymous with being resilient. What seems to be so needed, and everyone in education are calling for at the moment all the time, seems to be so needed in a complex world that is becoming more populated, information-laden, and layered by the minute. But let's go a little deeper. What exactly is meaningful happiness? It turns out that while what is meaningful to one person can vary a lot to another, there is one shared denominator for what people across cultures and religions report as giving them meaningful happiness in their lives. And you can probably guess what that is. It is being something for others. Giving. Volunteering. When we give of ourselves, we experience an array of health-producing hormones rushing through our biology, increasing our resistance to disease and adversity. In fact, giving is one of the strongest predictors of increasing our health and happiness. Here I usually underline the importance of meaning in our lives in general with a couple of parents' notes. My son is under a doctor's care and should not take PE today. Please execute him. It's a bit harsh. Dear school, please excuse John being absent on January 28th, 29th, 30th, 31st, 32nd, and also 33rd. In all fairness, they're written hastily in the morning. We don't want to judge anyone. They're still rather amusing. Please excuse Ray Friday from school. He has very loose vowels. That's what I have coming from Denmark, loose vowels sometimes. Please excuse Roland from PE for a few days. Yesterday he fell out of a tree and misplaced his hip. This one is my favorite, though. Please excuse Jimmy for being. It was his father's fault. Okay, they're amusing, but isn't it also interesting how we always immediately see meaning in it? We always, if you think about it, we always search for I mean, we presume that there's just one word missing there in that last one, but, you know, we see another meaning immediately. Isn't that interesting? I had a lecturer once who came into the lecture hall with an overhead of two people standing in an elevator, and then he started reading out the dialogue saying, "You think it's going to rain today? Yeah, it's hard to dress these mornings. Yeah, I wonder if..." And we were sitting there in the lecture theater. Has Wilf Savage lost the plot completely? And it wasn't until Wilf revealed that today's lecture is about socio-emotional relationships, and that little acts of talking about the weather can be very meaningful acts of social interaction to make the other person feel comfortable. It wasn't until he said that we said, "Oh yeah, Wilf still got it, you know. Good way to open a lecture." But Steiner also said, think about it, if you're cooking a pea soup and somebody comes around and says, "What are you doing?" I bet you're not saying, "I'm cooking 235 peas," provided you know how many peas you have. You say you're cooking a pea soup, don't you? Have you ever seen the child tear apart a doll, wanting to see how the whole arises out of the parts? If we walk towards a forest, we see the forest before we notice the individual trees. If you think about it, we are constantly 24/7 expanding or contracting information for the sole purpose of meaning making, either to ourselves or to others. Here's my main point, though, with all those small digressions. My main point is this: if meaning is so significant to us 24/7, why would we ever think that it's any less significant when it comes to our happiness and our health and our meaningful living? What would happen if we truly embraced this knowledge in our human endeavors, individually, nationally, and globally? What would happen if we made it as important to let children give to each other when they're very young as it is to teach them the times tables? Kathleen Townsend, in a survey, found that 60% of teenagers, when asked if they wanted to give, said no. But perhaps, as Townsend also concludes, that is because many of our teenagers have not had enough chances to give to others to begin with. 60 years ago, many children had to give to others out of necessity. Today, many children do not have to be anything for anyone, unless, of course, we understand about the importance of being something for each other, and we constantly include such an understanding in our curriculum, our parenting, and more generally, our societal practices. I'm going to give you a couple of snapshots because sometimes when I talk about this, even my colleagues, esteemed academics, some of them sometimes say, oh yeah, that's all that warm, fuzzy stuff, And I say, no, you're not listening closely. Okay, sometimes I don't say that, but I think this, you're not listening closely enough. Here's some snapshot of data around what giving does to us. Even when the giving is enforced, this is interesting, isn't it? Even when you come into a secondary school class and you say, oh, this week or this month or this year, we're going to clean up the river together with learning about the properties of water, or we're going to give in some other capacity in connection with learning the curriculum. And even though those teenagers some of them might be sitting there saying, oh, we don't want to do that, and rolling their eyes, guess what? They end up wanting to volunteer more afterwards. Altruism begets altruism. Giving causes more giving. We end up being more compassionate by inducing compassionate behavior in our fellow human beings. I mean, of course, as an educator, and I'm sure to many of you, this is not rocket science. Can you imagine if we left the times tables to children's innate thirst for learning times tables or nouns? We just do it because, we have a collective understanding that this is important, and so we are making it part of their lives. Yeah? What if we did that with giving, not just in a warm, fuzzy sense and a moralistic sense that do this because it's good, but with a philosophical understanding of what really lies beneath? Even when giving is enforced, the benefits remain. Students who are exposed to service learning or volunteering end up wanting to give and volunteer more afterwards. Dylan, Fink, and Fay, and others, these are just some snapshot of research, showed that giving is a strong predictor of increased mental and physical health into adulthood and reduced adolescent depression and suicide risk. We actually have some answers to the epidemic of depression and suicide we have experienced in our modern world. Billy and Csikszentmihalyi found that giving has a significant impact on teenagers' mental health, increasing happiness, hopefulness, and social effectiveness. Oman and Thorson followed individuals over the age of 55 for 5 years. Those who volunteered for 2 or more organizations had a 44% lower likelihood of dying, 40 within the period of the study, doesn't make you immortal, 14% lower than those exercising 4 times a week. And by the way, exercising 4 times a week is a very strong predictor of increase. In fact, Stephen Post, if you're interested in more of this research, he does a fantastic literature review where he collects all the medical and positive psychology research around the world. But Stephen Post and myself included, we haven't been able to find another predictor that's stronger than giving in the literature. And perhaps I should say here that there are others, but they're not fair to compare because it's things like smoking and things where you're already doing something that's, sorry if you're smokers, but it's just the medical science. You're already doing something that's detrimental for your health. So if you don't want to compare apples and pears and a subset of your population with the rest of the population, to me and to Stephen Post, giving seems to be the strongest predictor in the literature of increasing your health and well-being the most. How many of us have been taught this at school? And just to show that giving is not even just overt giving, because you probably also get this argument that people sometimes think of giving or volunteering as just sort of an overt simple action. But it's very complex philosophy that lies behind it. And just to illustrate that, there's again tons of studies, but just as an example, just 5 minutes of gratitude can shift the nervous system. So if I said to you, if we had 5 minutes extra in my talk, and I said to you, just think about something you're grateful, it doesn't matter what it is, just think about something you're grateful for, your nervous system would shift towards a calm state called parasympathetic dominance. In layman terms, it's basically the biorhythms, because all our organs are vibrating in a certain frequency. When they are vibrating in harmony, That's when we start producing the hormones that gives us health and longevity. When they are out of sync, that's basically when we are stressed and we become ill over time if that occurs for too long a period. Just 5 minutes of that, which is where heart, breathing, blood pressure, brain rhythm, and electrical potential of the skin are synchronized. All of that happens just with that 5 minutes of feeling grateful for something. After a month of daily 15-minute practice of appreciation, 30 individuals had a 100% increase in the potent hormone called dihydroepiandrosterone, as well as a corresponding 30% reduction in the stress hormone cortisol. Now, I'm not a medical doctor, but there's enough research of this to convince me that, I also don't know what the electrical potential of your skin is exactly, but let's be honest, who doesn't want their skin to be potentialized? Could save a lot of night cream with that. The bottom line is, there's something very significant that the research has found the last couple of decades that is incredibly important for our health. In fact, not just our well-being, but our biological organism. I find this revolutionary. Tell me if I'm too dramatic, but I find it revolutionary. And I think it should be up there with the times tables. What do you think? The conclusion of all of this research is that it's not just correlational, it's causal. Meaning that generous and altruistic behavior makes you want to be more generous and more altruistic. We have enough research to show that now. As such, if you think about it, giving and health and happiness together create a positive reinforcing loop. The more you give, the healthier you become, the more you want to give, and so forth. Giving or volunteering is a true community builder in that sense. Now, when I'm in my revolutionary mode, sometimes I go over and I point to that mountain there and say, that's nap plan. And usually from the teachers I get rapturous applause and so on. And don't get me wrong, I'm not some sort of, I think, nap plan can show some really important things, but the only problem with nap plan, of course, is it measures a very narrow aspect of the human being. And of course, what is also logical is that if you narrow a narrow gap of the human being's capacities and then tell schools that, that their prestige and their ranking and everything depends on that, we have a problem on our hands, because guess what? Obviously anyone who has, any sense will start focusing on the ones that your accountability is based on, So that's why I think sometimes when we think we're so smart, I like Fritjof Schuon when he says, if modern man is so clever, ancient man cannot have been that stupid. Some deep thought there behind that. And again, it's not to say that we don't have achieved so much and it's not a fantastic and wonderful world, but it is to say that wisdom that seems to lie beneath some of these research findings, if we connect the dots, is not yet on the policy radar, is it? It's not yet common curriculum in schools. It's not yet common knowledge. And that, I think, is the revolutionary seed in it. And I guess this is exactly what I wanted to tell you today. That this is where giving to others or volunteering shows so much promise in tackling our most pressing problems, and I'll come to them now. When do we, as a collective, for example, realize that our entire global financial structures are based on a theory, not science? Have you thought of it? It struck me the other day. I can't believe I hadn't thought of it before. Our entire financial system globally is based on a theory, not science. Our financial structures are based on the theory of supply and demand, and that everything will regulate itself because human beings supposedly are rational beings. We've already seen how this theory is flawed. The global financial collapse and the aftershocks in various countries have shown to us that humans are not always rational. They sometimes spend more than they have, and they sometimes take from others what is not theirs to take. What if we based the new economy on service-minded principles in which we ask not how we can constantly grow and have more, but rather who can we serve and how can we make this world more just for all? I remember sitting in my philosophy classes as an undergraduate thinking, how is it possible to have constant growth on a planet with finite resources? Just philosophically, it didn't make sense. And again, I'm not an economist, but there are other great economists now, like the UK, Tim Jackson, talking about this and talking about something very similar, that we need to change our economy. We need to change the philosophy behind it because constant growth doesn't make any sense with the problems we have on hand. What if we asked when is enough rather than how can we have more? Constant growth does not make much sense on a planet with limited resources. A financial model where we give to each other and share fairly what we have would make more sense, because the research shows it is what makes us healthier and happier, let alone provide us with some simple values that guard us also against dubious human behavior. What if we stopped the futile debate about whether or not climate change is primarily man-made and simply committed to the sacrifices that 98% of the scientific community is saying is needed to safeguard ourselves against impending environmental havoc? What if we decided to live on a planet with a commitment to give to it as much as we receive, to live truly in balance with nature? What if we stopped for a moment and realized that all the major religions and wise sages throughout time have had the same core message at heart all along? Christianity teaches us to love thy neighbor, to give. Buddhism says be compassionate to all living things, even be careful not to step on the ants. A central message in the Quran, in fact, is that love is the quickest route to human perfection. Giving. Core to all the great sages and spiritual teachers throughout the ages is the same core message coming out of modern scientific research now. To give is to fulfill your potential as a human being, to become the highest, healthiest, and most capable version of yourself. I am not advocating a religious viewpoint. I'm not negating it either. I'm merely highlighting that no matter how much we as humans have perverted the major religions at times, the core message in them is congruent with the data we have on giving and being something for each other. If one likes a less romantic way of saying this, Stephen Post concludes in his comprehensive literature review that the scientific data on giving echoes moral and perennial wisdom. So you start to see why giving might be a part of the key solution to our most pressing problems today. It basically provides us with non-ideological neutral ground that seems so inviting for all of us to walk together. A pathway where we can travel together because there's more that unite us than separate us, at least when it comes to some of the most fundamental and powerful aspects of our lives, our collective health and happiness. What would happen if we had a science of giving embedded in our educational practices, and that such an education be available to all? It's often said that the only weapon that will truly eradicate ideological extremism and fundamentalism is education. I couldn't agree more. But I would add that such an education would be even better in combating hatred and violence if it included the science of what makes us healthy and whole, as well as what doesn't. We know now that negative feelings and hatred toward others do the exact opposite of positive feelings and generosity and goodwill. They fill our bloodstream with the hormones that makes us sick and shorten our lives. Resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. the saying goes. The science supports such statements. I'm only here, of course, touching upon the surface of how a new science of generosity and goodwill could transform the world we live in. But I think it's obvious to see for everyone that giving is not just another thing to do. Volunteering is not just another thing to do. It might actually be a key component for not only individual, but collective health and well-being. Maybe we have always known this, even if only intuitively. Martin Seligman says all of the data on giving makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. When we give, we increase social capital, which in turn improves productivity and ultimately survival. Bobby, age 7, says that love is what is with you in the room at Christmas if you stop opening presents and listen. Yeah, isn't it interesting? You know, that I think I've read a lot of philosophy, and I can't say that in any of the philosophy books throughout time I've seen something as profound as what Bobby is saying here. Honestly. Love is what's with you in the room at Christmas if you stop opening presents. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I had Christmas in Denmark, and what I remember to this day is funny because I remember getting presents, and I used to have this little ritual that I would run to a little corner and have my little stash of present there, and then over to the next family member and get another little present. But you know what? To this day today, to this time today, I don't remember many of those presents. What I do remember is the love in the room, even though I was slightly subconscious of it at the time. But that's what stays with me today. It's almost like a metaphor for the modern life. If you stop being a consumer for just a little bit, and you know, we need to consume to some extent, but you know what I'm saying, you know, not that whole machine we've created where, how many commercials do you think we've seen by the time we're 12 advocating the pleasurable life over the meaningful life? Is it any wonder that the wisdom is slightly hard to retrieve, even if it is intuitive? Yeah? Despite his tender age, Bobby is saying loud and clearly that it takes an effort to not let the pleasurable life drown out the meaningful life. For over a decade now, and in addition to my university students every semester, I've spoken to numerous groups of college, high school, and primary school students about the differences between the meaningful and the pleasurable life. I've personally experienced how children and young people of today are desperate to transform their confusion into wisdom, into something that can help them make sense of their experiences, their traumas, their desires, their hopes and fears, their confusion. Something that can help them navigate a complex society. In fact, I often talk about giving starting with yourself. I didn't tell you, but the research is quite clear. Do you know where that threshold is, where all those benefits I mentioned before starts to wane off? It's when you're not giving to yourself enough. And I heard, fortunately I haven't been able to be at the conference before, but I heard that John Brockton gave a very, emotional speech about, in fact, that the need for us to be leaders, we need to look after this weird little space in the universe that is self, this clumsy little space. We need to be compassionate, and we need to give to that space, because if we run out of oxygen, it's a bit like when you're flying, they say, in the event of an emergency, please put on the mask before you attend to anybody else. You can't be a hero if you're running out of oxygen. And that's also why sometimes when I give these talks about giving, it's usually a mum, but it can also be a father. Say, I give all the time, I don't feel my skin potentializing, and I'm blah, 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 But then when I ask, are you sleeping enough? No, I often only get, are you exercising? Exercising. When should I get it out? Are you having time to do that thing, that creative thing that always makes you just come alive again? Whether it's dancing or it's painting? No, I haven't done this since college. When we drill down, there's too many of the areas of self-care that are lacking, and so therefore the giving to others don't have the effect that the research shows it could have. So that's important to keep in mind, that all this thing about giving, in fact volunteering, has to start with giving to self, because that is the foundation upon which we give and volunteer. There are many definitions of what wisdom is, but a simple definition could be we are wise when we do something that's healthy for not only ourselves, but the greater whole in which we find ourselves. It is a wisdom that I need not only when I stand in front of the fridge, contemplating how much chocolate cake is really needed now, but for living all of my life in a meaningful and balanced way for the greater whole. Furthermore, if social concern and being something for others is synonymous with a definition of well-being and wisdom, it seems that the research is quite clear as to how we can live more wisely. We can do that by giving more, and by extension offer people opportunities to give, to volunteer, and help them explore conceptually the many benefits of giving, just like we have done today. It is from this bigger perspective that I'm honored to speak to you today, because volunteering is putting into action what I'm advocating with words. Volunteering as a very practical way of giving and living the meaningful life is therefore a key in solving the pressing challenges and problems of today. I congratulate you in your efforts and wish you the best of luck growing these efforts in years to come. The world needs them. Thank you.